Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar, Part 1, The Developing Brain, a Neuroscience Perspective, presented by Dr. Laurie Slifka. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Dr. Miller, and hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Really looking forward to talking with you guys about the brain. So a little bit of background about myself. I have a PhD in psychology with an emphasis in behavioral neuroscience from the University of Missouri, St. Louis, and currently I serve as a full-time faculty member at Kaiser University in the graduate school. So just to start off, here are the learning outcomes for today. Essentially, at the end of this, you will be able to describe how the brain develops in infants, children, and adolescents, and understand the influence of genes and the environment on brain development, as well as some risk and protective factors that we're going to go over. And for the last point, we're not going to specifically go into this, but hopefully the knowledge you gain today will help you to develop strategies to help those who've experienced childhood adversity, and we're gonna go into what that means. Okay, so we're gonna start off by talking about the basic building blocks of brain development. So I wrote this earlier, and I was hoping that you all could take a look at it and maybe provide me with some edits. In academia, we're really into peer review, so we like to work together and edit each other's work. So I was hoping you could take a look and provide me with some edits. You can type them in the chat if you want. All right, so you're probably thinking, who are they having come to talk to us? She says she has a PhD, but clearly she can't write a paragraph. So I'm joking. I didn't write this earlier. Essentially, what I wanted to do with this was to show you an example of how cool the brain is, okay? So this is all scrambled up, but I bet you can read it. According to research at Cambridge University, it doesn't matter in what order the letters in a word are, blah, 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 blah. So this really serves as an example of how fascinating the human brain is. Human brain weighs about 3 pounds, so like a bag of rice you get at the grocery store. But there are so many things that it's doing all at one time. So the brain has the ability to complete a task like this, to get you to think at the same time, wow, this presenter's really missing a couple links. But also it's monitoring basic life support systems, so allowing you to breathe and your heart rate, keeping your heart rate going. It's receiving and interpreting important sensory information, so you're able to read this, you're able to hear me. It's storing information, helping you solve problems, create new ideas, all simultaneously. It's pretty freaking cool. So let's go into this really cool organ in greater depth. Here it is. Looks pretty simple, right? This is what we see, or this is what we think of when we think of the brain, okay? So in the previous example, we saw how complex this is. So I'm gonna go through various parts of the brain, but in order to try to break this down, I was hoping we all could create a model of the brain with our hands. And if we create that model, I think it'll help when I go through various parts of the brain, because then you can just look at your hand model, okay? So I'm gonna go through what I'm talking about right now, and then when I reference certain areas, I'll tell you where to look in your hand model. So you can just try it out, and then you can unclasp your hands, and then I'll reference it again, okay? So if you clasp your hands in front of you with your fingers interlocked, and you hold your clasped hands in such a way that your forearms are flush against each other, okay? So essentially you have like your hands clasped and then your forearms touch, okay? So when we're talking about various parts of the brain, I'll refer to this hand model, and I'll point to various areas in like with your hand and wrist to show you where the areas I'm talking about are located, okay? All right, so what we're seeing right now is what an adult brain would look like. So let's start prenatally. And I wanna show you what the brain looks like in utero, and then what it looks like at birth, and then we'll go into adulthood as well. Okay, so if you look at the picture on the left, this is what the brain may look like around 3 weeks, and this is prenatal, so this is after conception. And you can see that it doesn't look like the last picture, okay? So it starts off looking very differently. At about 16 days is where we see the start of the brain development. So essentially, the foundation of the baby's brain and spinal cord is starting to develop at this time. It starts off as what's called a neural plate. That grows longer and folds onto itself until the fold morphs into a groove. And then that groove morphs into a tube. That's what's called the neural tube. What we see around 6 or 7 weeks is that like more developed neural tube, and it closes. When it closes, it creates this bulge. You can see, I don't have a pointer, but you can see like that black area in the middle on the right side for 7 weeks. And that's where our brain, the brain is starting to be distinguished into like 3 primary sections: the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. And then under the hindbrain is what we typically think, it's the development of the spinal cord. So at the same time that this is happening, there's special neural cells that form and move throughout the embryo, and that's beginning to form the nerves. And the baby's brain is made up of millions and millions of these nerve cells. They're called neurons. We're going to talk about those in greater depth. So at the tail end of the second trimester, so around 26 weeks, the brainstem, which is the area that's important for life-sustaining functions like controlling heart rate, breathing, blood pressure, is almost entirely mature. It rests above the spinal cord and below the cerebral cortex, which is like the main, in these pictures, it's the main like pink area that you see. The brain, the massive growth takes place in the last 13 weeks. The brain grows from about 3.5 ounces at the end of the second trimester to about 10.6 ounces when baby reaches term. Okay, and it's starting to look more like the picture we saw on the last slide too. It's the once smooth surface is increasingly grooved and indented. So it's like the images that you're used to seeing, okay? So I had mentioned neurons. Neurons are really the building blocks of the nervous system. So I wanna go a little bit into what exactly a neuron is and what they do, okay? So neurons or nerve cells are the building blocks of the brain. They communicate information throughout the brain. So they communicate with one another. At birth, the brain has over 100 billion neurons. Believe it or not, this is about the same number that a child has as an adult. Yet, we know that the brain goes through enormous changes throughout childhood. So there's a lot of changes that take place at the level of the individual neuron and the communication between the neurons. That's something we're going to talk about as well, okay? There are 3 main parts of the neuron. So I'm actually going to try to use this pointer thing, wish me luck, here. Okay. So if you can see my mouse right here, the 3 main parts we're going to talk about are the dendrites. It's like this tree-like structure here, the cell body, which is what I'm circling, and then the axon, which is this long tube, okay? So we're going to go back to a hand model, but a different one this time, okay? So if you stretch out your arm and you put your fingers out, I bet it looks similar to that picture that you're looking at the left, on the left. Your fingers would represent those tree-like structures, and then your hand would be that middle structure, and then your arm would be the branch out structure. To go back to my, that you see here, okay? So your palm, if you stretch out your arm, represents the cell body, which is located here. This provides the main energy to the cell. So if we want to think of like our cell phone, this would be like the battery of our cell phone. Your fingers would represent these tree-like structures, which are called dendrites. They bring information into the neuron. So information sent from one cell to another, and this is what's, the information is going into the cell through this area, your fingers. So if you think about your cell phone again, let's go way back in time and think about when cell phones had antennas. This would be like an antenna of a cell phone, okay? Your arm is gonna represent the axon. So every cell has an axon. The purpose is to send messages out of the cell. So information comes into the cell through these, your fingers or the tree-like structures, and then through the cell, through the axon, and then out the other side into dendrites of a neighboring cell, okay? So if you think of your cell phone, again, the axon would essentially be the transmitter. And the axons are wrapped in this fatty protective coating called myelin. It develops as a child grows, and it really, really changes and develops prenatally and also postnatally into childhood and adolescence. If you think of like the rubber protective coating on the wires of your television, this is kind of like myelin, okay? So just like those wires, myelin helps messages move along axons more quickly and cleanly, okay? All right, so I want to briefly talk about the processes of these nerve cells. So essentially how the nerve cells start to develop and then how they develop and change prenatally, and then what processes take place prenatally and then extend postnatally, okay? There are a rapid amount of changes in neurons that take place from conception to adulthood. Okay, so here's like essentially the particular sequence of events. So neurulation is the first. So we're starting like on the left. And this can take place around 2 weeks after conception. And it's when that neural tube develops, which I was talking about before. The inner cells of the neural tube form the central nervous system, which is made up of the brain and the spinal cord. And the outer cells give rise to nerves outside the brain and spinal cord. So this is when those nerve cells really start to develop. And then after the development, like the initial development, there's a massive increase in the number of cells, okay? So this is what's called the proliferation stage. It's about a few weeks to 7 months. And then the baby is essentially developing as many neurons as an adult brain. And then we get into differentiation and migration. Essentially what those mean is that the neurons are traveling to their home base. So they're traveling to where they're going to end up being, like their final destination. So once a neuron has migrated to its final destination, it can proceed down 2 different roads. It can differentiate into a mature neuron. So what we typically see, it's like growing from a baby to a mature neuron and carrying on, or it can die off. And the process of dying off is called programmed cell death or apoptosis, okay? The next processes I'm going to talk about happen prenatally and postnatally. The first one is synapse formation, also known as synaptogenesis. A synapse is the point of contact between the 2 cells. So it's where the axon, so your arm, and your fingers meet. So it's the connection point between the 2. The first synapse are generally observed between the 23rd week of gestation, although the peak production occurs sometime in the first year of life. And just like neurons, there's an overproduction of them, and this follows by a gradual reduction. This process is called pruning, and this is highly dependent on experience. So there's more to come on this, but essentially we have more than we need, and then experience and environment help shapes our brain and prune off. So if you're like pruning plants, like prune off what's unnecessary and what's not helping us, okay? So until the stage of synaptogenesis or synapse formation is what it's called on this slide. It can be, the terms can be used interchangeably. The stages of brain development are largely gene dependent. So it's your genetics. However, once the brain reaches this point of synapse formation, it shifts into being experience driven. So it's basically what's going on in the environment and our experience that's shaping our brain from there. The timing of this pruning, so pruning off the unneeded connections, is really dependent on the area of the brain in which it occurs. For more like basic, like non-higher level functions, so like vision and hearing, those occur earlier. For more higher order cognitive functioning, like emotional regulation, inhibitory control, that continues throughout adolescence. Myelination is the last step in the process. It's essentially those wires that I was talking about with the TV. So like helping like to coat the TV wires, that's when the development of that takes place. So it's this fatty substance that wraps around the axon or our arm, if we think about our hand model. And that helps speed up communication from one brain cell or one neuron to another. the process of myelination differs based on the specific region of the brain. So regions of the brain in certain sensory and motor areas are myelinated earlier and complete around like the preschool period. And regions involved in higher order cognitive functioning, so like decision making, planning, emotional regulation, inhibitory control, happen later and can extend through adolescence and early adulthood. So this is what we see. This last slide is what we see prenatally and like slightly postnatally. But I talked a lot about changes in adolescence and early adulthood, and this is just a visual representation. The colors are essentially changes in the cell body and the dendrites that are happening over time. So this just shows you that there's changes that happen extending past prenatal development and early childhood all the way into adulthood. So our brain continues to change, okay? And this is due to the changing neurons, and the pruning and the myelination. It's all changing, and our experience is really helping to guide this, and we'll talk about that. So some key components with brain development, we're going to go into each one. Brain development is sequential. I think you guys have already gotten an idea of that, just looking at the previous model that I showed, that it happens in a sequential order. Change is use dependent. So when you say like use it or lose it. Organization is based on experience. We've already touched on that a little bit. And there are critical windows of opportunity, something we've already talked about as well. So there are certain times where certain regions are developing and they are more vulnerable to insult for that reason. All right, so the first point, that brain development is sequential. Let's talk about what I mean by that. And I want to preface this by saying that I'm not going to talk about every brain region. I just want to go over some basics, very important brain regions. And what that'll do is it's going to set the stage for the next webinar when we talk about damage. So if there's any specific damage to the brain or differences in the brain, it's associated, we're going to talk about what's happening in the brain and the associated behavior. So this will help set the foundation for that. So typically what we see, I'm going to try to get my pointer back here, is the lowest, most primitive parts of the brain. So essentially what we need for like life-sustaining function develop first, and then more complex higher order cognition develop later, okay? So it happens so that when a child is born, they have those life-sustaining functions already in place. That happens early, it's protective, and then experience helps guide the remainder of the brain development. So the lowest, most primitive functions that develop first are the brain stems. So you can see the brain stems located here. It controls the most basic regulatory functions like heart rate, blood pressure, body temperature. This part of the brain is mostly developed by birth. As you move like up the brain, like actually up the brain, the next major system to develop is called the limbic system. It's located here. It's important for appetite, sleep, and arousal. It mediates motor regulation, and emotional reactivity, and attachment. And then the cerebral cortex, which is like the outer fold layer, what we typically think of when we think of the visualization of the brain, it houses concrete and abstract thought. All right. So let's go over a little bit more in depth about each of these specific regions. So I had already said this, but I got ahead of myself. I got excited. But the brainstem performs these automatic functionings. So things that we don't have to consciously think about, our body's just doing. We're breathing, our heart is beating, our body temperature is being controlled. It's also responsible for, it assists. It doesn't do all of this, but it plays a part in digestion, sneezing, coughing, vomiting, swallowing. So let's take a look at our hand model. Okay, so clasp your hands together. Again, I know I'm going back and forth between one hand model and another, but if you clasp your hands together, you make your fist, Where your wrist meets, that represents your brainstem. Okay? So you're looking at the top of your hand model, that's the top of the brain, and then you go down and like where your wrist meets, that's where in the brain we're talking about right now. Okay? So a full-term baby's brainstem should be fully functioning at birth. It enables them to breathe, their heart to race, or their heart to beat, and it also helps control many reflexes. And these reflexes can be really important for attachment. So like if you see a baby that's tracking like a parent's movement, that's controlled in part by the brainstem. So now what I want you to do, I'm sorry, I'm going to put you through this morning, but I want you to think about something really embarrassing, like the most embarrassing thing that's happened to you. Take a moment, picture where you were, what was around you, what was happening. Okay, while you're thinking about this, do you feel any changes to your body? Your palms getting sweaty? Is your heart beating faster? Are you blushing? If you are, or in the past, felt any of these physiological reactions, this is an example of your limbic system at work. Limbic system is a complex set of structures that lies below the cortex. So in your hand model, put your hands together. It's the peak in between where your palms are touching. Okay? So it's like where your palms are touching. So it's like inside the brain there. That represents the limbic system. Another way you can think about the location of the limbic system is if you take the brain, you flip it over, and you look right in there, that's where the limbic system is. Okay? So here are some of the functions of the limbic system. This is not an inclusive list of all the functions, but some of them are attention, memory processing, emotion, appetite, thirst, and hunger. Here are the areas of the limbic system. I'm not going to go specifically in depth into all of them. We'll talk about them in a little bit greater depth in part 2 on Thursday. But some ones to keep in mind: the hippocampus is really important for memory. Hypothalamus is really important for appetite, thirst, hunger, and the amygdala is like our emotional center of the brain. Like if we see a snake, it's really important for fear. If we like see a snake, we know to like get away from it. Our amygdala is sending signals to help us with that. So these structures in general, a lot of them are responsible for emotions and motivations, and they're particularly related to survival. So like fear and anger. So if like there's something threatening, this is a part of the brain that can help us to like escape or fight. So like that fight or flight response, like to run away from something or to fight. All right, so we're moving up the brain. I had that arrow up before, and we're in the cerebral cortex. And it's like that outer area that you see when you're looking at the brain. So in our hand model, we look at it, the knuckles, like the bumpy part, that's the cortex. It can be thought of it's the thinking brain, okay? Even though we use our whole brain for thinking, this is what we primarily think of as the thinking brain. It's so complex that I'm not gonna make it too easy for you. It's divided into 4 lobes, okay? So the specific areas are called lobes, and we're gonna talk about them moving forward. So if you look at the bottom right picture, that's what I mean when I say 4 lobes. So that cortex is divided into these 4, and they all have different functions. All right, so the frontal lobe, it covers the largest surface. It covers about 1/3 of the area of our brain, and it's because it does a lot. It's one of the last areas of the brain to develop. So sometimes some adolescents may not have the best decision-making capability. So brains aren't fully developed. This is an important area of the brain for higher order behavior, such as inhibition and decision-making. And this is one of the last areas of the brain to develop. It's also important for voluntary movement, speech, and what's not listed on here is learning as well. The temporal lobe, which is the area in green, is important for memory, understanding language, and hearing. Parietal lobe, which is in purple, is what I seem to have difficulty with when I'm trying to drive from one place to another. I have terrible navigation skills. It's important for our position, spatial orientation. It's also important for sensation, touch, pressure, pain, temperature, and texture. And the occipital lobe, which is the lobe that's most posterior, which is an anatomical term for the back, is important for vision. Okay. So brain changes, as the brain changes, this is use dependent. So how it worked, the brain working out. So the brain is a use it or lose it organ. So it's like when we're, trying to build muscles in our arms, the muscles will go away if we're not using it. It's not exactly like that, but early childhood is a really important part important time, early childhood and extending into adolescence, but for like developing those muscles, essentially. So brains have the ability not only to grow, but to change. The scientific term is actually that the brains are plastic. Plastic's moldable, okay? So at one time we thought the brain was fixed by like 10 or 12 years old, but that's not the case. We now know that the brain's activity dependent, meaning like the circuits in the brain, like all of the connections, can change from experience. This is kind of like off track, but there's this theory called cognitive reserve. So essentially what the theory is that if you get into older adulthood, there's some research to show that in the face of pathology, so like in the face of disease, such as like Alzheimer's disease, individuals that engage in cognitive activity and physical activity will have a slower decline in brain function, despite the fact that their brains have the same level of changes as other people that may decline faster. So essentially, it's like building up those rich connections over a lifespan that can be protective for an individual. The organization of our brain is based on experience. So now we're gonna take a trip back when I was talking about pruning. So this picture shows the connections in our brain. Okay, so the first picture would be birth, the second would be around 6 years old, and the third would be around 14 years old. Okay, so do you remember how we talked about at birth, there's a massive amount of neurons and more connections than we typically need? Well, throughout birth to early childhood, we develop even more. So we essentially go through these like synaptic growth spurts. And as you can see, from childhood to adolescence, these neural connections are reduced through experience. This helps make a more refined and efficient brain. So essentially it's overdoing it, then it's pruning them off based on experience, so it's more efficient. So the experiences and relationships that infants, children, adolescents have continuously develop and change their brains and their neural networks. And this serves as the foundation for later development. So typically what we see, there's more to just positive equals positive changes, negative equals negative. There's more that goes into it, but just a simplistic view is positive for the brain, negative can be negative for the brain in terms of the development. There are also critical windows of opportunity. So what I mean when I say that is that we talked about how the human brain development is sequential. So if there's times that certain areas of the brain are developing and there's insult or something to occur during that time, it can be detrimental for those particular areas or those particular functions. And at the same time, it can be positive if there's positive experience that are leading to healthy growth and change of the brain during those specific times. So as the brain organizes, it requires specific patterns of activity to occur during specific times of development. During these critical times, the organizing brain is extremely sensitive to input from our environment. And the critical areas are different for each area of the brain and each neural system. And there are areas of the brain are responsible for different functions. So then what's actually happening in the brain is associated with behavior. More to come next week. So for the most part, our more basic functions are developed early. I think we've touched on that a bunch, but like language, hearing, eyesight, all very vulnerable during year one. So stimulation is needed to develop those skills. And then complex cognitive processing, like decision making, are later and extended through adolescence. And this is not all of our functions by any means, but this is just an example of what I mean when I say critical windows of opportunity. Alrighty. So I've talked a lot about how our brain is shaped by experience. So I want to go into both risk and protective factors. So once we get to the stage of synaptogenesis or synapse formation, our experience can really shape our brain. And these are really important things to think about. So the architecture of our brain depends on the influences of genetics and environment. So you may have heard in the past, nature versus nurture. We don't really think in terms of nature versus nurture anymore. We think more in the line of nature and nurture working together. So we're really not in that debate anymore. It's the interplay of both of them. So genetics is, they supply the basic plan for brain development. It provides the structure of the brain architecture and supplies the means for interconnecting nerve cells. Okay. The environment that the brain develops in has a profound influence in shaping the capacity of the brain. This begins prenatally with the brain's needing an abundant supply of nutrients. And an adverse environment can actually alter the genetic plans, and it can alter the developing brain. Experience, which isn't listed here, really goes hand in hand with environment. It essentially refers to the interaction of the child with his and her environment. So a healthy and stimulating experience can result in brain architecture that's able to operate its full genetic potential. You can have genetics present, an environment present, but if the interaction with the environment is prevented, the brain won't benefit from it. So persistent adversity, we're going to talk about that. It also can be referred to as toxic stress, can lead to weak brain architecture and impaired capabilities. So let's start off by talking about genes, and then we're going to talk about environment. I said they work together. They do. So we're not going to talk about them really separate, more so together, but we're going to start off going a little bit more in depth into genetics. So genetics essentially give us a range of possibilities for our function. The expression of our genes, so where it falls, the expression within that range is due to our environment. So essentially, like, genes carry the instructions that tell our body to work, but the experience can alter that, okay? The way we act is often based on the environment. And there's evidence to show that the environment can actually alter our genes. That's something called epigenetics. So experience writes on our genes. It determines how our genes will work, okay? And this can be passed on from generation to generation. Okay. An environment, importantly, can influence our gene expression even before birth. I want to show you an example of what I mean when I say the interplay between genes and environment. And essentially what I mean when I say that genes give us a range and the expression is due to environment. Okay. So what you see on the left side, or what's known as the y-axis, is risk for depression. So 0.3 would be a lower risk, 0.7 would be a higher risk. And then on the x-axis, or the horizontal axis, you see no abuse, moderate abuse, and severe abuse. So this is abuse that a child experiences. So there's a gene called the serotonin transporter gene. Okay. A baby will have one of 3 different combinations of this gene. It's based on what they inherit from their parents. They either can have what's known as long, that's LL. It's abbreviated as LL. It's protective. So essentially, what research has shown is that the risk for depression can stay the same no matter how much abuse a child has endured, for the most part. I mean, when I talk about research, I'm not saying everybody, but this is just generally the trends that have been seen. Short, long is moderate risk, and the risk increases based on trauma. Short, or SS, is more of the risky genetic combination. So the risk for depression dramatically increases based on the level of trauma. So let me show you what I mean by this. So in somebody that's long, which is known as the protective, you can see that the line is flat. So essentially, the children that experience all different types of abuse have a similar risk for developing depression. So it doesn't increase based on the level of abuse. With somebody with short-long, because short is the risky allele, so it's like the risky combination, there's an increased risk. So as a child experiences more, if a child experiences more abuse, or the children that experience more abuse with the short-long have an increased risk for developing depression. And then with short, there's a steeper slope. So essentially, if you look, I'm gonna try to get my pointer back out. If you look down here, with no abuse, the risk is similar to the other genetic combinations, but increase in abuse can lead to higher depression risk. And genes don't typically work in isolation, so this is a bit of a simplified example because there are a lot of other factors at play here, but I think this does do a good job demonstrating that our genetics can provide us with range, but oftentimes the manifestations of behavior occurs because of our environment, right? I also brought up epigenetics. Let me turn my pointer off so you're not watching that. Okay. So epigenetics is a really cool area of research that deserves its own webinar. There's a lot that goes into it, but not only do the genes that we inherit affect us, but the environment around us will actually like alter the genes that we have. So like all of the things we engage in, how much we eat, how much we exercise, if we smoke or don't smoke, or we experience high stress, exposed to chemicals, can all impact the way that your genes are expressed. And this can be passed on from generation to generation. So essentially, it's like switching on your genes on and off. So it's changing your genes, and this can happen constantly throughout the day. It's happening right now. There's epigenetic changes. And this can happen both prenatally and postnatally. So if a child experiences prenatal stress, it can actually alter the way that the genes are expressed, and postnatal as well. First, just to simplify this, it can lead to changes in the stress response, behavioral impairments, neurochemical changes, and central nervous system disorders. All right, so I keep talking about stress. What do I mean? Okay, so stress can be both positive and negative. And stress, different types of stress affect our bodies differently. So research has shown that like a moderate level of stress is actually a good thing. I don't want to try to draw right now because I'm afraid of not being able to get out of the screen. But essentially, say you're studying for a test, exam, and say you have like no like stress at all. You may not like care to study. That's not positive. But if you have too much stress going on, you may be like too stressed out to even study. So a moderate amount is good. And stress can be both it can manifest for positive events and negative. So like before my wedding, I felt a lot of stress, but it was positive. Before like a big exam I don't want to take, more like negative stress. So positive can lead to a brief increase in heart rate, mild elevations in stress hormones. Tolerable stress is serious but temporary stress responses buffered by supportive relationships. Where the problems come in is when we see something that's called toxic stress. So it's prolonged activation of our stress response and absence of protective relationships. So our stress response is built for like more abrupt changes. So if you see a bear in the woods, your body, the stress response is built in, so you run away from the bear. If you have chronic levels of stress and you don't have anything protective in place, like protective relationships, that can take a toll on your body. Adverse childhood events can activate toxic stress. These are some examples. This is not inclusive, but abuse, neglect, divorce of parents, household disaster, death of a parent or sibling. What we see is this can increase risk for, I don't love the distinction between like physical health and mental health, because mental health can manifest as physical, but essentially just mental and physical health conditions. So it can increase the risk for cardiovascular disease, diabetes, substance use disorder, mood disorder. This pyramid came out from the CDC. I think it does a really good job showing what can happen in the face of adverse childhood experiences. This doesn't happen to everyone. It's all very individualized, but just like a general chain of events that can happen. You experience adverse childhood experiences. This can disrupt neurodevelopment. So actually disrupt what's happening in the brain, which we talked about. That can impair social, emotional, and cognitive impairments, can lead to the adoption of health risk behaviors, which can lead to disability, disease, social problems, and an early death. So how does this work? I say it disrupts neurodevelopment. So it's actually disrupting the pruning and all of that. And it's also impacting the structures itself. So I mentioned the stress response system, okay? So what happens in the face of toxic stress to the stress response system, and how does that affect behavior, okay? So in the face of toxic stress, we experience this chronic fight or flight mechanism. So like our body running, or us running away from a bear in the woods, that's what's happening over and over and over again. And from that, there's this release of this hormone, it's called cortisol. And that typically is released in the face of the stress response, but there can be alterations in the amount of cortisol release in the face of toxic stress. What this can do, this alterations in the release of cortisol, is that can actually act on brain structures in the limbic system and change them. The limbic system is important for emotion. It's important for memory. This change in brain structure can change the behavior, specifically leading to this chronic stress response and reduced resiliency to coping throughout life, which can lead to additional toxic stress, okay? So this persistent stress is associated with persistent effects on the nervous system and the stress hormone system that has damaging effects on the brain's architecture and can lead to lifelong problems of learning, behavior, and physical and mental health problems. This is not in all cases. Just because you experience stress in childhood does not mean that you are going to have a negative outcome. This is just like an example of what could happen in like worst case scenario. So this image doesn't actually show very much, but it looks pretty. But essentially this was a study that took place in 2015 in 128 children between the ages of 9 to 15 years old. There were children, there were a group of children, the 128, they were divided into 4 groups. Children who had experienced early caregiving neglect while living in institutions or orphanages, children from low socioeconomic status households, children who were victims of physical abuse, and children who had experienced no toxic stress, based on the results of some questionnaires. What the results showed is each of the 3 groups that had experienced stress had smaller brain regions in the hippocampus and amygdala, which are important for memory and emotion, than the group with no toxic stress. So it actually, that stress had altered their brain. And I know this looks a little bit complicated. I will walk you through it. But essentially what they showed is that the volume of the brain, so when I'm talking about changes and smaller, it's a smaller volume. So the smaller, the size of the structure is associated with behavior problems. So smaller volumes related to higher behavioral problems. And the way that they were able to capture behavior was through interviews with children and the parents. So basically reporting of problems with teachers, disciplinary actions related to behavior. So what we see is that smaller hippocampus and amygdala volumes associated with higher reporting of behavioral problems. And so I don't want to just continue to be the bearer of bad news, because like I said, it's very individual. This doesn't happen in every case, but unfortunately, what happens to the brain in childhood sets the stage for adulthood. And the majority of my research has actually been in studying adult brain outcomes from stress in childhood. So I'm not presenting my own research right now, but this is what I've spent the bulk of my career studying, is how stress in childhood can actually set the stage and impact brain structure and cognition in adulthood. And so there are changes there are differences between adults that have experienced toxic stress in childhood versus those that haven't. I'm going to show you some examples of that. So this was a study from 2004 of 9,000 adults that showed that stress in childhood is associated with increased risk for depression in adulthood. The bottom horizontal is it's adverse childhood experiences, known as ACEs. So what this shows is that there's this effect with the more adverse childhood experiences that occur, the higher risk of depression in adults. And I had said that I don't love the distinction between mental and physical health, but this is an example of mental health. Here's an example of physical health. And if we go back to our pyramid, we see that physical health is on that pyramid. It's at the top of the pyramid. So this research shows that physical health can be impacted by early life stress or toxic stress in childhood. So essentially, the more adverse events that a child experiences, the greater risk for heart disease in adulthood. This graph shows these experiences lead to dramatically increased odds of having heart disease in adulthood. There's also trends that appear for other conditions like diabetes, stroke, obesity, and cancer. So just a quick summary. What happens in early can affect aspects of child development. Toxic stress can have a negative impact on the child's brain development. But I want to end really by a positive note. I didn't talk a lot about the positive, but I think it's important to keep in mind that nurturing relationships in early years are critical. So nurturing positive relationships in early childhood can help shape the brain in a very positive way. Early interventions are critical for optimal life course outcomes. So this is not like something bad happens and worst case scenario. There are interventions that can be done to help to create positive outcomes for children. So fortunately, or maybe unfortunately for some of you, I'm going to be speaking for another hour on Thursday. We're going to be talking about the developing brain again. This is part 2. So we're going to discuss some cool neuroscience research that's helped aid our knowledge of neurodevelopmental processes in both typically developing children and children with some neurodevelopmental and other disabilities. The goal of that session is going to be to increase understanding of biological underpinnings of various conditions. So hopefully, again, we had a goal in mind here. The goal would be to help individuals to foster both empathy and innovation and how we respond and educate children and adolescents with disabilities. So that is all I have. Thank you so much for coming. This has been really fun. Does anybody have any questions?
I don't see any questions right now, Dr. Slifka. What an amazing presentation. So informative on the development of the brain and very interactive as well for those that are watching this on record. So please note we will have another recording for the part 2 as well.
Thank you very much.
Okay, terrific. So we'll just be closing out today's webinar. So please feel free to put any questions that you have in the chat box as we go along. Thank you so very much.